Hello, and welcome to the first conversation as part of the Read the Constitution Challenge, a program brought to you by the American Cornerstone Institute and our More Perfect Union program. As you saw in the video that Dr. Carson put out, we have asked everyone to read or reread the Constitution, and then we're going to have a series of videos and discussions about various aspects of the Constitution. Some you may know, some you may not know. Today, we are joined by a very special guest, David Azerrad. David is an assistant professor and research fellow at Hillsdale College's Van Andel Graduate School of Government in Washington, D.C. His research and writing focuses on classical liberalism, conservative political thought, and identity politics. Prior to joining Hillsdale, Azerrad was the director of the B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles and Politics at the Heritage Foundation. He has taught previously at American University and the University of Dallas. A native of Montreal, Azerrad received his BA from Concordia University, his MA from Carleton University, and his PhD in politics from the University of Dallas. Dr. Ben Carson is the world-renowned neurosurgeon, author, Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient, 17th Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and the founder and chairman of the American Cornerstone Institute. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
As we discussed, our viewers have read the Constitution, hopefully, and are tuning in to have hear your thoughts on what it means. And today we're going to talk about how the Constitution protects liberty, and not through the Bill of Rights or other things, we'll talk about those later, but through its actual structure. And important to that is the separation of powers. We divide the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary into separate functions in the Constitution, as Madison said, concentrating those in the hands of one man or a few men would be the definition of tyranny. But even within that, in Article 1, Section 8, there are a lot of structural things in place that help protect liberty. And Dr. Carson, before we start talking about what those are specifically, would you mind talking a little bit about the framers' view of the importance of liberty at the time of drafting and ratification of the Constitution?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I want to thank David Azerrad for being here. It's wonderful to have a distinguished scholar and researcher on the Constitution in this conversation. You know, our founders were very, very concerned about the preservation of liberty. And they were scholarly individuals who had studied other civilizations and what had happened to them and how quickly liberties have a tendency to vanish. And our Constitution, I think, was a divinely inspired document, quite frankly. It has kept us free for a long period of time, although it's under some fairly severe challenges right now. But I believe in the long run, we'll get through it. There were a lot of arguments as it was being put together about how it should be done, whether it should be done, how complex it should be. It turns out not to be very complex, 17 pages long, written in a way that average citizens could understand it. That was a bit of an argument because the elites wanted it written in legal lingo, and where only lawyers could understand it, and that would have been pretty awful. But it can be read in one setting, quite frankly, and the real purpose of it is to make sure that we preserve those liberties, the very liberties that are talked about in the Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And how do we maintain those things? What has to go into it? And the thoroughness of it is really quite spectacular particularly when you add on the Bill of Rights. And I think America remains, because of the Constitution, still the beacon of freedom for the world, the destination place where people who are seeking freedom want to come. And even though there are those who proclaim that America is evil, the source of all evil, is systemically racist, etc., you still find people trying to get in here. People form caravans trying to get in here. So obviously those things are not true. And the goal of being a beacon of freedom obviously has come to fruition.
Yeah, that's couldn't said it better myself. So David, on the Constitution, before we start talking about the actual structural protections of liberty, we know that the Constitution cares a lot about liberty because of what they put in the preamble, what Governor Morris wrote when he was head of the committee of drafting. So if you wouldn't mind talking about that a little bit, about what's in the preamble that helps us know that the Constitution cares about protecting and preserving liberty.
Yes, before I do that, I just want to underscore what Dr. Carson said and commend you for what you're doing, because if there's one prejudice we need to correct in America, it's that the Constitution belongs to lawyers and judges, and that it's for them to read, for them to interpret. I'm going to give you the most extreme example of this I can think of is President Bush was given I forget, I think it was the McCain-Feingold Campaign Finance Act in 2003. And he said, I'm pretty sure it's unconstitutional, but this is something for the courts to decide, which is unreal. I mean, you're the sitting president of the United States of America. You have veto power over legislation. You swore an oath to uphold the Constitution, which, by the way, every elected representative in America, including at the state level, does. And yet we've gone to the point where we assume that the courts are basically tell us what the Constitution means. It belongs to them and we follow along. So it's very important to remind Americans that this is a document written by citizens for citizens, that it's accessible. Dr. Carson, you said it's 17 pages. I think it's 5,400 words without the amendments. You can read it in one sitting. Yeah, some of the clauses, I'll admit, can be, not necessarily clear, but you can look them up. So I think this is a wonderful endeavor. This belongs to all of us. Now, one part of the attention that gets very little attention, in part because the lawyers monopolize how we think and talk about the Constitution, is the preamble. I don't really know that there have ever been any major decisions on it, and so we assume that it doesn't really matter. We focus on what does the privileges and immunities mean in the 14th Amendment, whereas I think the preamble is immensely important because it gives you a sense of why we, the people, are setting up this government. Now, you remember one of the many incredible things about this country is that we took a first crack at setting up a national government and we failed. It was called the Articles of Confederation. In many countries, that would be the end of the history. You fight a war, you set up a faulty government, and then it devolves into some form of tyranny. Through some great blessing, we got a second chance to set up a government, and we produced a constitution. And this preamble lays out the 6 main reasons why we, the people, are setting up this government. The one I want to focus on, which to me is perhaps the most concise way to sum up the entirety of the American project, is the last one. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. To me, that's the mission statement for America. And it teaches us 2 important things. One is there's a difference between liberty and the blessings of liberty, i.e., not all uses of freedom will yield blessings, i.e., America was not conceived as a libertarian nation where, say, obscenity, pornography, and hard drugs are considered part of freedom. They yield no blessings, and therefore it is entirely legitimate to prohibit them. So, for example, the First Amendment does not protect obscenity. At least it shouldn't. And second, it reminds us that these blessings of liberty are not just for ourselves, but for our posterity, which means that, first of all, there has to be a posterity, which, at the time of the founding was not a big deal because everyone had babies. But today in the West, it's very much a serious issue because all developed nations, with the exception of Israel, their fertility rates are well below replacement. We seem to be losing the will to live. And it also reminds us that we need to teach the next generation of citizens how to be free. It's not something, you are born free, but to know how to be free is something that needs to be taught. And it's there is a certain libertarian streak in America that in a sense is good, this kind of manly, don't tread on me, I can run my own thing spirit. But sometimes it can go too far in that we forget that this is a communal project with a future orientation. The point is not just liberty for yourself right now and who cares what comes after you. It very much is an intergenerational project. You're a custodian. You inherited, all of us here inherited these blessings of liberty from much greater men than we are. And it is now our task as trustees, as custodians, to pass it on to the next generation. And to me, really, that these are the most beautiful words that I've read in the entirety of the American political tradition. I think it's this line about securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity.
Amen. I would heartily agree with that. And, you know, it was interesting that the founders recognize that there is a tendency for governments to expand and encroach upon those liberties, and that it actually requires active participation by the populace in order to maintain them. And it's nothing special about the United States or Great Britain or any place else. It's human tendency to want control. And, you know, it was really rather genius the way it was written in order to guarantee that. Now, of course, for it to continue to be effective, we must demand that it be followed. That's the real issue. Are we going to have the willpower as the people to hold the feet to the fire of not only the legislators, but the judicial branch? I mean, sometimes they seem like they're not brave. And you can't be the land of the free if you're not the home of the brave.
So in Federalist 56, Madison takes up the question, look, what ultimately is going to keep us free? And he says, ultimately, it's not the Constitution, it's not the Bill, I mean, there's no Bill of Rights at the time, it's not an independent judiciary. What it is, quote, the vigilant and manly spirit of Americans, a spirit which nourishes freedom and in return is nourished by it. Another mistake we need to guard against is the ideas that the founders gave us some sort of a perpetual motion machine where they put it in, you know, got it going, and we just get to chill out as Americans and, you know, go camping, have barbecues, make money, go to church, but that we don't need to worry about preserving liberty because, oh, the founders gave us a constitution. The Constitution can only do so much work. At the end of the day, we need citizens from all walks of life who are civically engaged and mindful of the fact that the buck stops with them. So amen to what you said.
And just a practical application of that. You know, right now we're dealing with the COVID crisis. And the reason that I think a lot of people are concerned, not so much that they don't want to take vaccines, not so much that they don't want to wear masks, but they're concerned about the mandate, because does that create a precedent so that now the government says, well, I think we're going to mandate this and that and this and that. Once you start opening that door, it becomes problematic. And it's going to require some very careful maneuvering to make sure that we keep people healthy and safe, but at the same time, make sure that we do not open the door to obliteration of some of those freedoms.
If there is one thing that tyrants and autocrats and people who are in power want, is a subservient and passive population. And you'll notice that a lot of the freedoms that they do not restrict are the ones that neutralize the spiritedness of citizens, of young men in particular, because they're usually the ones that cause trouble in the good sense. So pornography today in America, by all means, have at it, 24/7, free, private, on the internet, on your phone. That is the kind of freedom that the regime is willing to allow because it crushes the spiritedness of citizens. The opioids, the various drugs, the mindless and endless entertainment, the gadgets, things that, you know, basically ruling Americans through pleasure. So, you know, on the right, we tend to focus on Orwell in 1984. And there are elements of 1984 present today in America, especially with the rise of big tech and the surveillance state. But I feel that Aldous Huxley in A Brave New World doesn't get enough attention. And Huxley's dystopia was not a tyranny through fear, but through pleasure. That you allow the citizens to lose themselves in the pursuit of dopamine, and they become passive and subservient. So, lest you misunderstand me, I'm not suggesting we be a nation of killjoys who don't laugh and who don't enjoy a good meal and who are not allowed to watch TV. But one needs to be mindful of this fact that it very much helps those in power to have a population consumed by the pursuit of pleasure, because it detracts their attention from realizing and recognizing what is being done to them by those in power.
I hope I'm not repeating an urban legend, but my understanding is there is a letter from Orwell to Huxley, basically saying that Orwell believed that Huxley's dystopian future was more likely to come about, in that he realized that the way to your point, to kind of dominate a populace is through kind of making them sleepy as opposed to keeping your foot on their face the whole time.
Yeah. So, I say this because we look, the founders were great men, far superior to anything I will ever be. So I'm not even criticizing them, but look, they had a different set of concerns. I mean, we don't live in the regime that some of the things we're dealing with, they couldn't fully anticipate. That is not to say that the Constitution is outdated, not at all. It's just to say that we can't rely on the crutch of the founders to do the hard work also for us of thinking through what needs to be done today. This problem of pornography that I think is underappreciated on the right, the damage it has done to the American character, to families. I hear a lot of my friends on the right talk about the importance of the family, to which I say amen. But at this point, who does anti-pornography work full-time on the right? In the way that there are dozens of people who do work on cutting taxes, on occupational licensing reform, on school choice, not to disparage the importance of these issues. But this is something that is doing very serious damage to the regime. And I don't think the threat is properly recognized. And this is a case where the founders, you can find what they said about obscenity, but they couldn't imagine that we'd have something like the internet, which has become the greatest delivery mechanism for obscenity in the history of mankind. So I guess that's another thing we need to guard against, is this idea that, well, the founders have answers to everything. No, they don't. There's guidance, there's a framework of government, but to return to what we were saying, the onus is on us, this current generation of Americans, and I should say of Canadians who aspire to become Americans, to think through these difficult issues and what ought to be done about them, to preserve liberty for ourselves and for our posterity.
Yeah,
Those are very good points. And, I was in Florida, I was in Lee County, and some of the school officials were showing me some of the material that's being used to teach the children. And it was pure pornography. Absolutely pure pornography. I've never seen anything like it. I was shocked. And we're talking about kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth, fifth graders. Unbelievable. But the other mechanism, I think, for controlling people is to create dependency. And as governments expand and insinuate themselves into people's lives, usually with sugar-coated things, we're going to give you, free college, and we're going to give you food, and you can't be evicted. And it goes on and on, a minimum guaranteed salary. And people become totally dependent on the government, in which case you exercise control. And that's how you change a country like ours into a country like Cuba or Venezuela.
Yep. You each brought to mind actually some of my favorite Reagan quotes. Dr. Carson, Reagan said, "As government expands, liberty contracts." And the concept of dependency is clearly along with that. You rely on the government to do a lot of things for you. You forget how to rely on yourself.
Exactly.
And David, he also said that liberty is never more than one generation away from extinction.
Yeah.
To your point, kind of, it has to be learned. It is not the natural state of the world.
So that quote I like. I agree with Dr. Carson about the problem of dependency on the state, but I don't like the libertarian formulation. And look, Reagan wasn't a libertarian, but he spoke libertarianese often. I don't like the idea that you need to choose between liberty and the government. First of all, it's not true. That's not how the founders thought about it. They gave us the federal government. Now, it's not the federal government we have today, that goes without saying, but they did not think that the government was the enemy of liberty, because this implies then that we'd be better off in the state of nature. They were not Rothbardians, they were not anarcho-capitalists. The second problem is, look, we need to accept that in 2021, 80 years after the New Deal, Americans, for the most part, are not dependent wards of the state, but they have come to expect, and accept that the government has a role in taking the edge off of markets, in providing some stability and security. I just don't want to accept that the choices are either no government or we're all dependent wards of the state, because it's not the way voters think about it. I don't think it's the way the founders think about it. So look, part of it is on the right. We need to make an allowance for the fact that Social Security is very popular. You know, there's an apocryphal Tea Party sign. I looked into it. From what I can tell, it never happened. It's the "get your government hands off my Medicare."
Yeah.
But even if it's not true, it speaks to the fact that, 70+% of Americans like Medicare. Now, look, Medicare is unsustainable. We're going to need to reform it. But I don't think it's a winning electoral strategy for Republicans. I don't think it's a winning rhetorical strategy for conservatives to be too anti-government. I don't think the two of you would disagree with me, but that I don't like that Reagan quote. And again, Reagan's a great man. I don't say this out of a lack of respect, but too much government is the enemy of liberty, but not enough government is also the enemy of liberty.
Well, we also had a Read the Declaration challenge a few months ago, and as you know, in the Declaration, it says the governments are instituted among men to secure the rights that pre-exist government, right? So I think there is always a recognition that we have to have governments to do certain things. The question is how big and what do they do? And I think that's where we fight. And it's funny you brought up Social Security when we're talking about the Constitution. And even though you prefaced by saying the Constitution should not be the province of lawyers, I am a recovering lawyer myself. So I'm
a recovering journalist. That's even worse than you, Eric.
But when you combine the Constitution with the Declaration of Independence, I think you come up with a very good formula, because the Declaration of Independence talks about our God-given rights and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, when you're deciding what measure of government is enough, I think a lot of the answer is if it doesn't interfere with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When it starts to interfere with those, you got a problem. If it's interfering with your liberty, you got a problem. If it's interfering with your life, you got a problem. So that's what I think we should be thinking about.
Yeah. So let's move on to the actual text of the Constitution. Like I said earlier, as most people know, we've got separation of powers between the three branches, but then even within that, there are certain structural safeguards that help protect liberty. And one of them is right there in the very first parts of Article 1, which deals with Congress, that says all legislative power herein granted. David, could you talk to us a little bit about how that is a safeguard of liberty, and then kind of the part B of that, which is Article 1, Section 8, which actually lists out what the powers of Congress are, and help kind of explain to our viewers what that does to help protect liberty.
Yes, and let me first underscore the point you made about separation of powers. The founders intended for there to be gridlock. Let me use DC language. The founders intended that at the national level, it'd be hard to get things done because they wanted to ensure that there truly be a national consensus on the issue. So separation of powers is the enemy of efficiency. One of the false siren songs of the left, of progressivism, that needs to be resisted is we want a very efficient government. Now, in a sense, we do, i.e., we don't want waste, fraud, incompetence. But on the other hand, it's not what our government was designed to do. It was meant to slow and check things to ensure that the government doesn't overstep its bounds. So a certain gridlock is not a bug, it's a feature. Separation of powers is meant to slow things down. Now, Article 1, Section 8, you'll notice that Article 1, Section 8 is different than Article 2 and Article 3. Article 2 begins with the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America, not all executive powers herein granted. Ditto with the judicial power in Article 3. Whereas the legislative power, Congress does not have plenary powers to legislate over whatever it wants. Congress receives 17 specific enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8, and then the necessary and proper clause to implement them. And the way to think about these 17 specific powers is these are areas in which we as Americans will speak in one voice. So, for example, foreign policy and trade with other nations. We can't have the state of Virginia declaring war on France. We can have Congress declare war on France. We, the American people, via our elected representatives, because foreign policy is not the domain of the states. So if you look at these 17 specific enumerated powers, they're quite limited. I mean, it's trade with foreign nations, war and peace, letters of marque and reprisal, which are to deal with piracy, currency, the post office. It really is the ideas where we cannot coherently speak in many voices. But what's amazing to me about that clause, Article 1, Section 8, is how many powers are not there? I mean, what about families? What about churches? What about commerce? What about all the things that fill up our lives? And the view of the founders was these are things that will be dealt with at the state or local level, or not by government at all in civil society. So Congress is given a restricted grant of legislative powers, and it was not designed to be the body that deals with all problems. You know, I remember during the Obama years, Michelle Obama took up bullying as one of her issues. Now, bullying is not good, but the founders would say this is not a national issue. Now, you can use, of course, the bully pulpit or the platform you have as First Lady to talk about it. But we need to remember that not all problems demand a national solution. And that was the thinking behind Article 1, Section 8 is you restrict those powers, but it means by contrast that the states have much broader legislative powers than Congress. They can deal with education, they legislate marriage, for example. Much more aspects of life fall under what gets called the plenary police powers of the state compared to Congress. At least that was the intention.
The 10th Amendment makes it very clear that the states are the ones that should be doing these things, but I think we've all noticed that the federal government seems to be becoming much more the center of focus these days. And it seems like we actually expect that to occur. But one thing that I find fascinating recently is that Supreme Court said that the federal government, the executive branch, does not have the authority to extend the eviction moratorium. But the executive branch said, we're doing it anyway. What is there to sort of stop the executive branch from just going wild and doing what it wants to do?
So look, let's set aside the particulars of this issue. Because of separation of powers, in a certain sense, there is no one branch, according to the founders, that gets to decide what is constitutional or not. At the federal level, we have three co-equal branches that can have disagreements. So the way we think about it today is kind of, you know, I once saw this analogy in a civics book and I thought, my God, this is not good. that the Constitution is like a baseball game. Congress and the president are the batter and the pitcher, and the Supreme Court is the umpire, outside of the game, overseeing the rules. That's not the way the founders thought about it. It's a three-way struggle. So I think from a constitutional point of view, not looking at the issue of evictions, the president is not bound to defer to the Supreme Court on the constitutionality of a particular measure. The president can say, I swore the same oath to uphold the Constitution as you did. I believe that your reasoning is incorrect. This is a case of judicial overreach. In the same way that the courts claim the power to strike down legislation that they think is unconstitutional, I, as the president, will strike down a Supreme Court ruling that I deem to be unconstitutional. Now you'll say, well, what happens then? Well, look, they each have means to check one another, but ultimately one side is going to have to back down. But I would want to provoke more of these constitutional crises so that the executive and Congress can relearn to flex their constitutional muscles and chase it. And by the way, I should add, the states too, because at least Congress has some illusions and pretensions of having real power. The states are, the extent to which they're deferential to the federal government is pathetic. Now, there's a bad stench attached to what I'm talking about because it brings back images of southern states resisting desegregation. So if you talk about the states saying no to the federal government, we have the images of Eisenhower sending in the troops in Little Rock to desegregate the schools. And you're like, oh, are you defending segregation? But look, in recent years, the states have defied the federal government on marijuana, and then they defied the federal government on sanctuary cities. So these are two causes where the left has said, we are defying federal law. And as much as I disagree with the reasoning in each one, I would like to see a little bit more principled defiance. I don't mean willy-nilly anarchic, but if you make a reasoned argument as the governor of a state that a particular piece of legislation or a particular Supreme Court decision you think is unconstitutional and you explain your reasoning in the public, I would invite a little bit more of that because it would ultimately lead, I would hope, to some chastening of the federal government and of the courts, and would recreate some space to give the states some room to customize policy that suits their citizens. If we want liberty, we need to be more comfortable with, here's a word that gets used all the time, but in the wrong way, but with diversity, by which I don't mean different skin colors and everyone thinks the same way. Look, let Florida be Florida, let Vermont be Vermont. And if you're not happy being in Vermont, move to Florida, or, get involved in Vermont politics and change it. But the homogenizing effects of everyone adopting the same policies, deferring to the same Supreme Court rulings, also threatens liberty. So to answer your question, Dr. Carson, ultimately, there is no one part of the government that gets to decide what the final meaning of the Constitution is. We end up having, through some give and take, a settled understanding that takes place, and that becomes the norm. And if you think that a particular actor has gone out of control, look, Congress, they all have powers against each other. So if you think that a president is flaunting the Constitution, he can be impeached. If you think that a judge is flaunting the Constitution, he or she can also be impeached. Congress can defund, has the power of the purse. So they all have means to check one another, but it's not the way we're used to thinking about it, I think, because we want the reassurance of these are the people who say once and for all what it means, and this is not how the Constitution was designed.
Well, we have had several cases in recent years of federal judges stymieing executive orders.
Yes.
And saying, you can't do that. Now, where in the Constitution does a federal judge have that kind of power?
And here's my question to you, or rather, let me answer with a question. Where in the Constitution does it say that the president is bound by the rulings of some district court judge in Hawaii? So look, in a certain sense, if the judiciary is bold and they're advancing their ambitious interpretations and overstepping their bounds, I can almost understand that. powers of an expansive nature. What I have a harder time understanding is why the others go along with it. Now, part of the answer is, I think, every branch of government is surrounded by lawyers. Eric, I'm very sorry to attack your profession, but the president is surrounded by lawyers, Congress is surrounded by lawyers, and they all have drank the Kool-Aid on judicial supremacy. And they end up being told, well, you need to listen to. Now, look, I want to make clear, I'm not calling for anarchy, that every time a ruling is issued, you defy it on the grounds that, well, I swore not to uphold the Constitution. This would be chaos. But there are certain egregious rulings. There are times when I think a principled reasoned case can be made, not for states' rights, not for invoking Calhoun and secession, none of that. I mean for invoking the founders' Constitution, saying a particular branch has overstepped its powers, and you don't even need to say strike down. Look at the language of Marbury v. Madison. The court there ruled that the court has the power to set aside legislation that it deems to be unconstitutional. Well, let's get presidents and governors to set aside a court ruling that they deem to be unconstitutional. Now, you need to do your homework if you're going to do that. You're going to need, because everyone's going to think you're crazy, they're going to call you names. You need to prepare your entry in the public square, write up the speech, argue it. The person who I think is very good on this, if any of your listeners want to look him up, is a law scholar. I think he's at University of St. Paul or somewhere in Minnesota, is Michael Stokes Paulson, who is one of those rare law professors who is not a judicial supremacist. And I think his scholarship on this is first rate.
Yeah, there is a strain of thought in the academic literature around the idea that Marbury versus Madison is just wrong, in that the court does not have the authority to set aside these statutes. Or the reason Marbury gets complicated is because the statute at issue dealt with the courts.
Yeah.
So there's kind of the strong version, which is it was just wrong, and there's the weak version, which it was right with what it was doing, but wrong to extend it beyond that.
Yeah, and I'm not taking a position on that one. I'm simply saying apply the logic of Marbury to the other branches, and I think it's sound. So I do think the courts can set aside. I don't like strike down, because that language is not in the Constitution. It's not in Marbury. Again, it implies that they're standing above everyone like God smiting people. No, that they can set aside, statutes that they deem that violate the supreme law of the land. Because look, all of us are bound by the Constitution. And so if you do a judicial ruling, an executive action, or a statute that violates the Constitution, then yes, it should be struck down or set aside. But it applies to all three branches, not just two of them.
The other thing to remember about judicial review is that it was so popular and thought to be so important that it was used to strike down a law again after Marbury in Dred Scott. It went 50 years between, to use your phrase, setting aside as opposed to striking down. And the second use was in perhaps the worst opinion in the history of the Supreme Court. So it does have a checkered past. I would love to talk about Article 1, Section 8 for the rest of time, including how, the Commerce Clause is perverted beyond all meaning right now.
But you would lose all your listeners, Eric, if you did that for the rest of time.
Yeah, but it'd be you and me, and that'd be fine. I guess a couple other structural issues in the Constitution we want to talk about, and Dr. Carson, maybe you start with this, is the Take Care Clause in Article 2, which governs the executive and the presidency. And you, being a cabinet officer in the last administration, were concerned with taking care that the laws be faithfully executed, right? So can you talk about how you brought that to your job at HUD?
Well, I think it's interesting that there was one instance where I was before a congressional committee, oversight committee, and we were talking about whether the federal government should be responsible for subsidizing housing for people who are here illegally. And the law already states that the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development may not participate in subsidizing housing for such individuals. But there were many people in Congress who said, but you should do that. And I simply made the argument to them that this is the law. And I don't have the ability to change the law, but you do. So are you asking me to violate the laws that you have created? Or is it better for you to go back and change the law to what you think it should be? And I got tremendous pushback on that, which I found fascinating. It is really, I think the legislative branch has a responsibility to legislate and not to put that responsibility on the executive branch. Although, as we have been seeing, administrative prowess has grown significantly. And all the various cabinet agencies do actually create law now. And that was not supposed to happen. So I'm not sure where we should be going with that. I'd be real interested in what David had to say about that.
It's a great story you share. You know, Congress has figured out a pretty, they got a good, it's a scam that they're running is, you know, we need to do something about X. Well, let's pass a big law that tells the bureaucrats to address the issue. So we get to go give the press conference and tell the American people, we address the issue of climate change, homelessness, you name it. Now, the regulations start coming out of the agencies, and then the American people are not happy. And what does Congress say? Those darn bureaucrats, they did it again. Yeah, they did it again. You gave them that power. So they get to claim credit for addressing the issue, but then they get to pass the blame for the hard trade-offs that need to be made when dealing with an issue and pushing it into the bureaucracy and allowing this to happen. The story you tell also, you know, we have this strange conception of executive power. You know, when I teach the Constitution, I always ask my students, why do we have an executive? And almost never do people, you know, properly answer the question. And it's not that complicated. It's just laws are not self-executing. They're not self-enforcing. Someone needs to prosecute people who break the laws. Someone needs to pass the law. Someone needs to resolve the disputes over the law. But you need an executive. Laws themselves are not self-implementing. So the task of the executive is not, you know, to set a vision for America, to give State of the Union addresses, to tackle every issue. It's to take care that the laws that were duly enacted by the people's representatives be enforced, that they be executed, that lawsuits be brought against those who violate them. And beginning in the progressive era, we have this shift towards the more visionary expectations of what a president and an executive is supposed to do. You know, it's supposed to be the leader of the nation. You know, I've noticed this bad trend. I think it began in the Bush years of constantly calling the president the commander-in-chief. Now, he is, according to the Constitution, the commander-in-chief of the United States military, but not as a day-to-day when he's in the public square with citizens, only in his capacity as the head of the military. He's the president of the United States of America. I don't think we should be calling him the commander-in-chief as if he's some sort of a military leader day-to-day. You know, there were some very interesting debates at the time of the founding over what to call the president. And Washington prevailed and got them to, I forget the particulars now, but to settle on nothing too highfalutin. That this was, you know, they wanted to get rid of the regal stench of England and remind citizens that, yeah, this is a citizen, he's a public service, he's more prominent than others, but let's not go too far. I, for one, for what it's worth, you know, I find it very strange that we continue to call presidents president after they leave office. I think that we owe respect to those who've served, but, you know, George Bush and Donald Trump and Barack Obama are not presidents of the United States. You could say former president, but I find it strange that we continue to call them Mr. President when they're no longer in office. But look, that's a small quirk. At the end of the day, even if we fix that, that wouldn't address the deeper issues.
All right.
So there are a number of people out there who will say that the Constitution does not actually embrace liberty. It has a lot of defects in it. The foremost among those would be the fact that it allowed slavery to continue. And Dr. Carson, can you take a shot at addressing why those critiques are not really correct?
Well, first of all, people criticize the fact that we had the 3/5 amendment, that a slave was only worth 3/5. And I don't think most people understand why that was enacted. It was enacted because it gave the South, with their slave states, much more power than they truly deserve. And it was an attempt to sort of equalize the power of the North and the South. It sounds terrible that this person is being counted as only 3/5 of a human being, but remember, those persons were not actually given any rights in terms of voting or anything else. They were just being used, just like today for the census. We use anything that breathes so that we can get more representatives in an area. And that obviously has some drawbacks associated with it as well. So yes, there's no question that we were wrong as a nation to engage in slavery, but do remember also that we weren't the only nation to engage in slavery. And in fact, slavery has been a part of humanity since the beginning of history. And there are actually more slaves in the United States today than there were in 1863 in terms of human trafficking. We should be every bit as concerned about that. The only thing that made us unique is the fact that we were willing to fight the Civil War, in which we lost a substantial portion of our population. And I think we need to be, sort of concentrating on the fact that we had so many people who were against slavery, who were willing to fight to get rid of slavery. Some people say, well, they weren't fighting to get rid of slavery. They were fighting to keep the Union intact. Well, the reason that the Union was not going to be intact was because of slavery. So you got to really look at the big picture in dealing with these questions.
Yeah, Eric, I'm glad you bring up this issue because this is the number one slander today that is used to discredit the entirety of the Constitution and the founding. That the Constitution, we are told, is a pro-slavery document. Now, that is nonsense on stilts. The 3/5 clause that Dr. Carson mentioned, I think more nonsense has been written about that clause than any other clause in the Constitution. It doesn't say that Black people are worth 3/5 of a human being. It says that for purposes of determining the number of House seats that a state gets and taxation from a state, you count up the free citizens, you exclude the Indians, not because of their skin color, but because they're not taxed and not considered citizens at the time. And then you count up 3/5 of all other persons. So it doesn't say Black people. Other persons is a euphemism for slaves. Madison did not want the word slave to appear in the Constitution, and he used the word person to underscore their humanity. As Dr. Carson said, the Southern states wanted to count their slaves as 5/5 of a person to inflate their representation in the House. The Northern states rightly said, you treat them like chattel, but then suddenly you want to count them as citizens? We don't count your cattle to determine the number of seats you get in the House. So what did they do? They compromised. And they settled on 3/5, which is the number they had settled on in the Articles of Confederation. But that clause did not apply to all Black people. So there were free Black citizens at the time of the founding. They counted for one. And here is something I have found that, for all the talk of race in this country, which never ends, I have met very, very few Americans who know this. Free Black Americans were voting in 10 states at the time of the founding. And I'm pretty sure it's a first in recorded human history that Black people voted alongside white people in elections. Why? The Constitution does not say that only white men get to vote. The Constitution says the states decide who votes. And now, I am not going so far as to say that the Constitution was anti-slavery, because it didn't abolish it, because the southern states would have never consented to sign the Constitution had it gotten rid of slavery. So I think that the principles of the Declaration of Independence are resolutely anti-slavery. All men means all men. Every single founder knew it and said it time and time again, and everyone made clear that slavery violated the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution failed to abolish slavery. Failed is not the right term. It was not the task of the Constitution to abolish slavery. Nothing stood in the way in the Constitution of any state that wanted to abolish slavery. And eventually, with 3 amendments, you could say we completed the Constitution by getting rid of slavery and guaranteeing equal rights under the law for all American citizens at the state level, and then guaranteeing the suffrage in the 15th Amendment. But nowhere in the Constitution do the words Black and white appear, do the words slave or Negro appear. So one debate we're allowed to have is, could the founders have done more? I think that's a reasonable debate to have among citizens. I think it is slanderous to just dismiss them as a bunch of racist slave owners and to say that the Constitution was pro-slavery. This is an ignorant and malicious slander that is simply not supported by the facts.
Yeah. David, you mentioned voting as well. It wasn't just that free Blacks were voting, a whole host of other people were voting, right?
Women, talk about another amazing one. This I know is a first in recorded human history. Women voted in the state of New Jersey for about a 10-year period at the time of the founding. Then the state of New Jersey got rid of that. So, when we say that the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, I would modify it and say it secured the right to vote, i.e. it guaranteed it. But nothing stood in the way before the passage of the 19th Amendment, women were voting in a majority of states. Now, that's not to say that, the 19th Amendment guaranteed that right, and it's important. But there's, it's amazing. We're so obsessed with race and sex. And these 2 facts we just discussed, that some women voted at the time of the founding and that some Blacks were voting at the time of the founding, no one seems to know. Because it seems that the only history that the elites are interested in telling is one that makes us despise our country, that makes us ashamed of our past. They don't like to tell us good things about the past. They want us to despise the founding. So look, in saying that, everyone recognizes the injustice of slavery, the fact that women had fewer rights. It's not to take it to the other extreme and deny that, but one can recognize that the Constitution, as it's publicly understood, the prejudice against it is incorrect. Women were voting in New Jersey. Who knew that?
And who knew that some of the very first slave owners in the United States and the South were Black?
Yeah, and that some fought in the Confederacy. Yeah, look, it's more complex than that. Absolutely.
Yeah. My favorite anecdote about voting is that women have been voting, I believe it's in Wyoming, since before it was a state. They gave women the right to vote to attract them out to the territory at the time. And then when statehood came around, they just kept it there. And to your point, the 19th Amendment did not go from however many states there were at the time, 0 to however many states there were at the time. It was more than half at the time it was passed. And it really was just changing the outliers as opposed to kind of introducing this new thing into the body politic. We're running short on time, but in the video Dr. Carson did, we did solicit some comments and we have time for one. This one's from Bradley in Washington, D.C. He wants to know what the founders left out of the Constitution, if there's anything you think that needs to be in there that isn't. And Dr. Carson, I'll start with you. If there's anything you think about what we need to put in the Constitution, or where the founders might have done better in structuring our government?
Well, maybe something that would encourage or incentivize education, because education is the real key to freedom for virtually anyone. It doesn't matter what their circumstances were. And some of our founders also talked about that in reference to the Constitution, how our freedoms would be preserved only through a well-educated and involved electorate.
It's a very good question. I would say the 14th Amendment, for all of their care of protecting citizens' liberty from abuses by the state. The original Constitution contains some safeguards against the state governments abusing the liberty of their citizens. Namely, Article 1, Section 10, for example, is a mini Bill of Rights applied to the states. But I think the 14th Amendment, properly understood, i.e. not the way that the courts have interpreted.
Important caveat, and we're probably going to have a whole
Yes,
episode of this on the 14th Amendment.
No substantive due process, no penumbras and adumbrations that produce rights to privacy out of which you get a right to abortion. I think the 14th Amendment, properly understood, completes the Constitution, because it says that the state governments can also not violate certain core rights of American citizens. So I think that's something that was missing and was nicely completes the Constitution.
That's a great point. This has been a fantastic conversation, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So David, you want to give us a couple of parting thoughts? Read the Constitution. I kind of went after the internet because of what it's done vis-a-vis pornography. But one thing that it has done is it's made a lot of great works accessible. The Heritage Foundation, where I used to work, has a fantastic online resource called the Heritage Guide to the Constitution, which allows you to click on every single clause and amendment and look at A, how the framers understood it, and B, what the courts have since done to it for better or for worse. And it's a really interesting resource that I think is within the reach of many citizens. So I would encourage all Americans, all patriotic Americans, to reclaim their Constitution from lawyers and judges and politicians, and to read it and understand it themselves. That's great. Dr. Carson, any closing thoughts, please?
First of all, I just want to thank David Azerrad for really enlightening the audience on this topic. And, I really believe that the First Amendment, which guarantees our speech, but also religious freedom, is so vitally important. Why? Because when Alexis de Tocqueville came to America to study this nation in 1831, because the Europeans were so fascinated with how this fledgling nation, barely 50 years old, was already competing with them at every level, they wanted to know, what the heck are they doing? And, he kind of studied our businesses. He looked at our government. He looked at everything. But he was most inspired by the fiery sermons that were coming out of the pulpits that gave America morality. And he concluded by saying, America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. I think our Constitution helps us to be good.
That's a great way to go out. To all our viewers, thank you for joining us. Thank you, David Azerrad. Thank you, Dr. Carson. And this is the first of many, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.